Hi everyone! So today's video is going to be quite special because we're going to be talking about 10 things I've learned after 10 years of writing. So I started my writing journey in May of 2014. I was 12 years old, I was in grade 7, and I wrote my first book in a little notebook that ended up being about probably 10,000 words long, and that really kickstarted my writing journey. Now, I have been wanting to make a video talking about the 10 most important lessons I've taken away from the last 10 years for quite some time, especially as someone who makes videos on writing, who has in the past made a lot of writing craft videos. What's the most important things basically that I've learned? And it might surprise you because a lot of it is not actually about craft. So let's jump right into it with number 1, and that's chasing improvement isn't worth sacrificing writing. What I mean by this is when I was sort of midway through the last 10 years, so around year 5, year 4, 5, 6, I started to really want to chase improvement. I wanted to get better. I wanted to improve my writing as much as possible to become a good writer. I spent a considerable amount of my drafting time worrying about if the writing was good, if I was good, if I could get better, if I should just delete what I was writing, or if I could improve at all. I found at one point that this became really damaging to my mental health. This was about like 6 or 7 years into the journey. Will I be able to write as well as I want to, as well as this person does? It started to really sort of emotionally impact me and therefore stop me from writing. I think with also the saturation with information that we get online, I also started to get worried about, am I following the advice? Am I doing it right? And all of that anxiety sort of compounded me into not really writing at all or just freezing. Now, this is where I think of improvement only as a concept, because it really is only a concept that you can measure, because improvement is so based off of how we feel and how we perceive if we're getting better. Therefore, there's no finite way to determine if you've improved. And I know I spent a lot, especially of sort of my late teens, stressing about if I was good, if I was already getting worse than I once was. I wish I had spent that time really just writing. And that's something I always try to emphasize on this channel, that I know it can be like the number one step. How can I just get better at this thing? But honestly, what the last 10 years has taught me is it's not the getting better that was important. It was just the sticking with the writing, like actually just doing the writing, doing things that made me happy, that generally led to me becoming happier with my writing. Whether that meant I improved on the line level, maybe, but what it improved really was my relationship with my writing, and that was the most important thing. Number 2, speaking of improvement fluctuates. I talked about this, I think, in a video I made in my dorm. I was like sitting on my desk in my dorm. I'll link it in the description. I can't remember what it was called. It was like problems I'm having with writing and how I'm gonna fix it, I think. I will link it. I was 18 years old and I was feeling very like insecure and down about my writing. At the time, I was writing Mothwork, which I will link a video on if you want to learn more about it. But it was the first book I had written in third person present tense. It was the first book I'd written in a different narrator's point of view. And for some reason, I was really hung up on it being bad. I was really stuck on, oh, this is just no good. I just don't feel good about it. And I remember thinking what I wrote like last year when I was like 17, the year before when I was 16, was so much better than what I'm writing right now. And so the whole video talks about that and how I was beginning to realize that writing is not a linear process. It's not something where, okay, the next day you're going to get better, and the next day you're going to get better, and the next day you're going to get better. It's more like overall, you can kind of see, I've talked about this metaphor before, you can sort of see that upward slope, but they're going to be like little, down here, then it comes back up, over time in the short term. At least that's how I view writing. So honestly, some things that I wrote at 17 are better than the things that I write today. Better than the things that I write today, or they impress me, and I think it goes to show that you can enjoy the writing of your younger self. You can still be impressed by and want to sort of emulate the work of your younger self. So there are a couple other things in this own point, that you don't have to bring down the work of past you to uplift the work of current you, you can actually be like, wow, that was great writing. Like, I loved what I wrote. I was 17 then. Whoa, that's crazy. You can be impressed by past you, but also that it's okay. Like, if something that you're writing today doesn't match what you wrote back then, because you're not there. You're not the same person that you were back then. You're not in the same spot. You're not in the same circumstances. You're literally not breathing the same air, So I think I had this really big fear when I was 18, 19 that I was regressing, that I was getting worse at writing. And it was really hard on me because I had started my undergrad with a lot of people being like, you're so impressive. Like, you're so good at this. Like, and I loved hearing it. And the support was absolutely amazing. Not to say that the support was bad, but I think I started getting into my head. I'm like, everybody thinks I'm really good. And I'm starting to feel like a bit of an imposter because I feel like I'm just getting worse and worse. So in the end, I actually wasn't regressing, is what I learned, because writing isn't linear progression. And when I threw that idea out the window, it's been so much easier to just continue to try new things, to experiment, to make mistakes, because just because I make a mistake or write something that I don't really like doesn't mean that I'm regressing in my practice. It's just something that didn't really work out. And I think the ability to move past that feeling of dissatisfaction with your own work is really the mark of improvement, if we're going to talk about improvement at all. Not really a term I like anyway. Improvement, it's kind of an irritating thing to me to think about. So my third point is that writing for yourself is a practice of longevity. I didn't start my writing process thinking that I was going to write for other people. I started writing because my sister came up to me and was like, I want to write a book. And at the time I was reading a lot of YA dystopian that I liked. And I was like, I want to do that too. And so I started. It didn't come into my mind that I want to write a book so I can publish it and like be impressive and go on book tours or whatever. But very shortly after I started writing, I really pinpointed on publishing and becoming well known and famous and everything. And I was a teenager, right? I was like 13. And so of course I had these grand dreams of having lots of attention on my work and being like beloved by people. I realized over time that actually the thing that mattered most to me was writing projects for me, first and foremost. And I know people say that and it can sort of seem like a very like abstract concept. What do you mean, like, write for yourself? Now I have a whole video talking about writing for yourself if you haven't checked it out. And I feel very humbled when people tell me, oh, I feel more comfortable writing for myself because of your videos. So that's why I'm going to continue talking about it. But I love writing what I want with me, me as the audience and my enjoyment at the forefront. I know that in the writing spaces and publishing spaces, we can focus on the reader and the trends and the publishing industry and what sells or whatever. But the thing is, those things always change and you're going to be here for the rest of your life. So it's great to almost just focus on what you want rather than the things that are just inevitably going to change because the industry is always changing. For me, it's like, write what you want and that's how you'll keep going. Because whenever I think of writing something that I don't want to write, it makes me feel very stuck. And I have spent nearly exactly the last 10 years writing Fostered, which is a series I've been writing for many, many years. I will link a video in the description talking about it if you are not aware. That's really been my big focus, and I just want to write that for the rest of my life. And whatever projects come in between are whatever projects that come in between. But for me, I want to really still focus on writing for myself. And if that means one day the project might be published, that's what it means. But it also doesn't mean that something I write just for myself doesn't have value just because it's not going out to hundreds of people, thousands of people. If it's only being read by my eyes, it's still valuable because I'm a valuable reader to myself. This is also really important for me in like an autism sense. In the middle of this journey, honestly, toward the end of this 10-year period, I was diagnosed autistic, which was awesome when I was 19. And it really recontextualized all my relationships so far with my writing, with my characters, why I was so connected to this certain series, this certain characters, why it gravely upset me. I would cry all the time thinking about having to end the series, like listening to the advice of, oh, don't write a series that's long, it's never going to sell or whatever, thinking I'd have to give up on it to write something else that was more serious. So writing what I want is also an act of self-care because it's also special interest. And I mean self-care in like a really genuine way. It really does emotionally nourish my brain. So writing for myself isn't just a, oh, I'm writing for myself kind of thing. It's also like a deep practice in my life. My fourth point is that most of confidence is learning how to push forward. Now, maybe I will have a different definition of confidence in the next 10 years, but for these last 10 years, I think that's really something that I've realized, especially in the last 4-ish years or so, 4 or 5 years. Now, my addendum to this point is most of confidence is learning how to push forward till mistakes don't bother you as much. And so that's sort of like the full sentence put together, because one thing that I have realized over time, as I've sort of had to accept my mistakes a little bit more, is that it's not really, the confidence of, oh, I feel really good about my writing that matters so much. It's more, well, can you keep moving when you make a mistake or you do something that you don't like? What will your reaction sort of be? So for me, I'm still confident in my writing. I'm confident in my ability to write. I love my prose. I love my style. I love my writing. I love my characters. I love what I do. I think I'm a smart writer too. But there are still times when I'll be writing something and I'm like, this is it's not working. And for me, confidence has been sort of learning to take a step back and be like, I'm just going to keep moving. I'm just going to move forward. And confidence for you might look like something else. But for me, it's just accepting that I can come back later. I can look at it later. I can reread it in a time where maybe I'm refreshed. I can reread it with somebody else's perspective. For example, I can get a critique partner to read it, revisit it. I can revise it, sort of things like that. Instead of letting my insecurity sort of run my writing process, the confidence really comes from learning how to move forward. So that is a bit of a surprising lesson, because I didn't think that would be the case for me. My fifth point is that understanding the core of a story can be more challenging than writing it. Now, this is a little tale about a novel I wrote called Feeding Habits. Now, Feeding Habits I've talked about a lot because it was such a disaster to write. And it was a disaster because I didn't understand what this story was about. And I also hadn't expected that understanding the story was going to be the biggest battle. It wasn't, plotting it. It wasn't writing it. It wasn't revising it. It was literally understanding what story I was trying to tell, and not in like a plot sense, but in a deep emotional sense. It took me over a year to actually come to terms with, to understand what I was trying to do with Feeding Habits. And when I was able to do that is when I was able to finish it. And I find that honestly, that lesson has carried over for pretty much everything that I've written. Having to understand the core of the story can be really, really tricky, especially if you're somebody like me and you thrive on the discovery process and you don't want to spend a lot of time sort of in like the pre-production of writing a novel. You just want to get into it. It can be hard to write sort of without as much of a plan, without knowing what the core of a story is, but also it's a huge gift to uncover the core of the story and to be surprised by it. Now, obviously writing Feeding Habits was extremely stressful for me, and it was also like very kind of damaging to my mental health. However, I don't know if I would necessarily change. Obviously, I would change the parts that were distressing to me, but I wouldn't necessarily change how it happened, because I think I began to understand the story when my life experiences mimicked a relationship that I didn't really understand existed in that book at the time. And so sometimes time is what you need, and sometimes time is the only thing that'll reveal that core. And that's something that's really hard to accept, especially as me. I'm somebody who likes to have as much kind of instant gratification as possible. And when I have to wait a little bit for my own brain to sort of figure out what I'm trying to do with my own story, it can be really tricky. But that's why I remind myself, if I don't understand the core of a story, it's okay. Sometimes it just takes time, and sometimes it is more challenging than writing it. So if the only thing I can do is write it, that's the only thing I can do. And one day I'll figure it out. My sixth point is that the only process that matters is the process that works for you and that actually gets you writing. Now, I have talked about this a couple times on my channel, but it's something I'm just going to say a million times. The only process that matters is the process that actually gets you to write, okay? I don't care if you're an outliner. I don't care if you're a pantser. I don't care if you're a plantser. I don't care if you use Save the Cat, if you use the snowflake method. There is a lot of information on how to write online, and the only way that matters is the way that actually gets you to write. And that's something I want to just reiterate to people, because writing advice is so easily accessible online, and it's great because we get to learn so much for free. And I'm a proponent for making content accessible to as many people as possible. But it can also be information overload. when you're getting a lot of information on authortube, on blogs, online, on Twitter, things like that. It can be really hard when you're hearing a lot of different information. Am I doing this right? Am I doing it wrong? Nowadays, algorithms really reward you as a YouTuber. Coming from my background, it rewards you on negativity and bringing other processes down. It rewards you on being very black and white. Oh, this is why you're doing something wrong, or here are the 10 things you're doing wrong in your writing, or whatever. Now, I've made content like that before. People I admire have made content like that, and I like some of those videos too. But as a viewer, sometimes it can be like, oh my gosh, like, how do I sort through all of this information? Maybe I'm just doing absolutely everything wrong. How can I do everything right as a writer? And the only thing I have to say is the only way to do the right thing in your writing process is to do the process that actually gets you to write something. So if that is outlining, it's outlining. If it's pantsing, it's pantsing. If it's doing both, it's doing both. If it's ignoring literally everything you ever heard about writing, that's the process that works for you. And that's the only process that matters. I remember in 2017, I was planning a sequel. It was a spinoff to Fostered. It was the very first spinoff. It's called Alanis, and some people might remember it, like from when I was on Tumblr back then, talking about outlining it, because I remember saying to myself, I was 15 years old, and I said, I'll be good and ready to write this project when I'm an outliner. I will be able to write this book of my dreams when I can actually outline this book, when I figure it out, and that's when I know that I'm going to be a good writer. And I tried so hard to shoehorn myself into that process, and it just did not work with me or how my brain worked. And it was hard because I never ended up writing the book. And I also was like, how come this process is just not working for me? And I just didn't realize it's because I already had my process. I didn't need to work against the sort of intrinsic way that my creativity wanted to unfurl. So don't listen to what people are saying is the right thing to do. Even me. Use whatever advice works best for you. And maybe that's just the information that you tell yourself. Maybe it's just your own process that works the best for you. Number 7 is that insecurity doesn't quite go away. It just changes and can coexist with confidence. And now this is a really interesting one for me. It might not be the same for you, but I think something that I've come to accept is that insecurity is going to be a part of my life. It's not going to go away. I am going to be confident about my writing, and still the insecurity is going to be there. I might just view it in a slightly different way. That's what I mean by it just changes. Now, I had this period when I was 17, 18, where I was really confident about my writing. And I was also very insecure about it. I was confident because I went to university. I felt like I was in a good place for that year. I felt kind of like ahead. I felt excited. I was getting a lot of positive feedback. So I was like, I'm confident forever now. I'm never going to need to learn how to be confident ever again. And then I had a really rude awakening when I was writing Feeding Habits, the project I was just talking about, when the insecurity came back so bad that I could barely write a sentence. I would need a thesaurus for like every single word. I didn't feel like my writing was valid unless there was something smart about it. I couldn't just leave a first draft on the page. I had to rework my writing over and over again. There are vlogs where I go over my really rigorous editing process. I used to rewrite every single line in my chapters in order to edit them, like sentence by sentence, rewriting them. Now I can write a draft and the little voice in my mind will go, I don't really like that. And then I will also at the same time say, it's all right. It's all good. I'm just going to keep going because it's not really a big deal. And maybe tomorrow I'm going to like it more. So I'm just going to allow myself the time and distance to just be creative in the next 15, 20 minutes without being critical. And then I'm going to move on. And so I have learned to accept that insecurity is sort of a part of my writing process. And despite the insecurity, I can still move forward with my writing. It doesn't have to stop me from writing. So I remember making a conscious effort when I went back to Feeding Habits a year after stopping the draft. I was writing the new chapter and I had to tell myself over and over again, it's okay that you don't like the sentence. We're just going to keep going. Nothing bad is going to happen if I keep the sentence that I'm not happy with in this draft. And then guess what? When I came back to reread it 3, 4, 5 months later, I didn't even really make revisions because I was totally happy with what I'd written. So it's sometimes like the insecurity changes in that I am now confident about my work where I'm at right now. So it's still there, but it's sort of changed in that I know that I can try to coexist with it. So my 8th point is that I'm forever a beginner, and I like that. Now that might seem weird, like to people who are watching this, like, what do you mean? Like, you've been writing for 10 years. I've written like many, many novels, and like, it's like, what do you mean you're a beginner? That's crazy. I feel like a beginner. I feel like I don't know anything about writing. I feel like I'm very new at it. Despite having knowledge about it, I don't ever feel like I've learned everything about writing, is what I'm saying. I love that learning doesn't stop with writing. And I think one of my favorite writers, my favorite writer, honestly, Garth Greenwell talks about this and sort of like the writing workshop model. And if you don't know his Substack, you should check it out because he talks about crafts and stuff all the time. It's one of those Substacks that I also recommend like paying for like the archive if you want to read it, because it's just really great information. But talking about how you're kind of forever a student, you're kind of forever learning as a writer. And I love embracing that. I think embracing that is one of the most important ways I learned to push past my really bad insecurity and imposter syndrome, because I told myself, well, if I'm constantly a student, if I'm constantly learning, if I'm constantly trying to adopt new techniques to learn from new writers, that means that I've never really mastered anything, and that mistakes are just part of the process, and that mistakes don't mean anything about me or how good I am, because mistakes are just part of it. It's not really a big deal. If you're always learning, you're always going to be making mistakes. And so I've loved sort of incorporating that mindset into my writing process. It has really relieved a lot of stress. And it's also allowed me to experiment a lot more. If I didn't have the mind of, I'm a student, I'm always learning, I'd never have written novellas. And I love novellas now. I'd never have written a chapbook. And I love chapbooks now. I'm going to continue to write them. Sometimes it's giving yourself the permission not only to fail, but to be a student, to always be learning. When I make a mistake in a recipe, it's not a big deal, I tell myself. I just try to adjust it so I enjoy the final product. And so that's sort of what I try to do with writing too. It's never the end of the world when you make a little mistake or you learn something. Oh, I oversalted the dish. Well, I can fix it by doing XYZ. And I kind of try to do the same thing with writing. Now, my 9th point is it's okay to change your mind a million times. So this used to be so difficult for me to deal with that it literally changed the trajectory of my writing career, my writing process a million times, where I would have told somebody I was going to do a certain thing with my writing, or I would have put it online. I would have talked about it with a friend. I would have shared something with a friend, like my writing or whatever. And when I shared something, even if it was just with myself, I felt like I was beholden to that vision. I had to stick to that vision. And it took me a long time to realize that no, you're not actually beholden to a vision because you've told other people about what you want to do, whether it's you've told other people you're publishing the project or you've committed to doing something with somebody else. You can actually do whatever you want for the rest of your life. And with writing, especially for the people who are trying to, let's say have a balance of publishing and personal work, or you're trying to not publish at all, it's okay to change your mind a million times. So I remember being really stuck on publishing this one book when I was a teenager, and it felt like, oh, I can't just give up on it because I spent so much time on it and I'd feel bad. I asked people to help me with it or whatever. And what happened? I can just change my mind now. And I learned that actually I could change my mind a million times. It doesn't mean that the time was wasted. It doesn't mean my writing was wasted. I learned a lot still. And so if you're somebody like me, when you set your mind to something, sometimes it can be like, but I don't want to change it because I already talked to them about it. Then sometimes you realize it didn't really work when you tried it, and it's actually okay to change your mind. Whether that's changing your mind about what you want from publishing, like me, I changed my mind. That's okay to do. Whether it's changing your mind on a plot thing that you came up with, deleting a character that you realize that you don't want to write with anymore, that's okay. It's really about writing in a way that makes you happy in the current moment. So if you need to change something to do that, then go ahead. Now, the final thing that I learned in the last 10 years of writing is that you can always write like you're 13. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by this, because I always say the same thing. And actually, funnily, some people like on my channel will say the same comment about, they started writing when they were a kid, they were a teenager, and they just want to write like they did when they were 12, like they did when they were 13, like they did when they were 14, something like that. Ages like the really young ages when you were just having a lot of fun. Now, I remember being like 15 and being like, I just wish I could write the way I did when I was 13. I'm like, hello, it's been 2 years. Like, relax. You literally can. And it took me until I was 19 or 20, I think, to actually realize, so not much later, but still to realize that actually forever I could write like I was 13. And what I meant by that is that I could write with fun and my joy at the center of the process, and that you can too. That you can put forward what you want to see most in the world because it would make, the inner teenager in you really excited. For example, when I set out to write Seventh Virtue, which is my contemporary fantasy alternative universe to the literary fiction novels I write, I was like, I really just want to feel the way I did when I was 13. And writing that book showed me that I could. I could absolutely still have joy in the writing process. I could still write quickly if I wanted to. I could still write a lot if I wanted to. I could still, take a U-turn from plots that I actually didn't like. I could leave mistakes in the narrative. I could just skip past parts that were boring. I could leave plot holes in the book. And it didn't matter because I was just writing like I was 13. I was just writing for fun. I was writing with me at the center of the process. And I think somewhere along the way, it became really difficult for me to understand that I could do that. It felt like, no, I can never have fun writing ever again. Writing's going to be a very serious thing that takes me all day, where I take, 6 hours to write 20 words or whatever. That's going to be how it is for the rest of my life. And it's not going to be fun because I didn't enjoy doing that. Some people might actually enjoy taking 6 hours to write 40 words, and that, to each their own. That sounds fun in some context to me as well. But what I realized is I actually can have fun because who's deciding that I can't? If I want to have fun and write a silly little magic book, what's stopping me? So if you have been wanting to get back to writing like when you were young, if you started writing when you were younger too, or if you're just new at writing and you don't want to write because you feel insecure, you're going to make a mistake, you can literally just write to have fun. You can write just because you want to, and that is valid enough. I felt like, oh no, I'm getting older now. There's no way I will enjoy writing at that same level. I peaked at 13. I think that I have enjoyed writing even more sometimes now at 22 than I did at 13 when I thought I had the most fun in my entire life. And so I wouldn't have gotten there if it wasn't for me just knowing that I could center myself again in my writing process. That's everything I've learned. Let me know what you've learned on your writing journey, whether or not you've just started writing, whether or not you've been writing for many years, and let me know if any of my points sort of resonated with you as well, because these are the main takeaways that I really had to do some self-reflection to think on. Oh, really, what have I learned in the last 10 years? And I think these were the big 10 for me. Thank you so much for anybody who has been here to celebrate the last several years in this 10-year stretch. I've been on YouTube for 8 years, I think, of the 10. So thank you so much for all your support. If you have ever said anything nice about my writing, let's chat more in the comments. But for now, I'll see you in another video. Bye.